Hey, good afternoon, everyone. And we're just going to give everyone a few minutes to trickle in before we start our next session. For those of you who haven't joined one of the Rockerbox webinars before, you are able to add any questions that you have by using the chat functionality on the right-hand side of your screen. So we will be stopping for questions as we go and at the end. So please don't hesitate to add any questions into the chat, and we'll respond as we see them. And for anyone who's just joining, we're just going to give it a couple more minutes here before we get started. Awesome. Well, I think we can start with a little bit of background and some intros while a few more people trickle in. But really excited to have this conversation today. As you know, really the theme of today's virtual conference, is around prepping for the holidays and wanting to speak to a few topics that are really pertinent for the brands that Rockerbox works with. And one of those is thinking about consumer spending. And really, what sort of impact changes on consumer spending are going to have on the way that people go about their holiday shopping this year, and what sort of impact that might have on the way that you want to plan your spend or even your media buys. So, really excited to have our panel of experts with us today, and we can do some really quick intros here. I can go first just because I'm speaking and I already know many of you, but I'm Kelsey and I'm our head of customer success. And I'll kick it over to Katie to start us off.
Hi, thank you. I'm so excited to be here. I'm Katharine Mckee. I am the founder and principal consultant at Morphology Consulting. We are a digital commerce consultancy. My background has been e-commerce. Thank God that took off for about the last 16 years in CPG and luxury. So we focus a lot on data and helping customers be more profitable within the structure of consumer demand.
Awesome. Maybe Jim, if you want to intro yourself.
Sure. My name is Jim Lebenthal. I'm the Chief Equity Strategist at Cerity Partners. Cerity Partners is a registered investment advisor servicing $70 billion in assets under management. Primarily, those are individuals and families. So the typical retail investor, albeit on the high net worth side, as opposed to institutions. So the perspective that I bring today is that of an equity investor, which means that I'm paying attention to macroeconomic variables as well as what specific companies are saying. And I'm excited to be here today because there's a lot of news going on that I think will impact answering the question of how is the consumer doing.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today. And then last but not least, we have Alexandra.
Hi, thanks everyone for joining. My name is Alex Greifeld. I am the founder of Know Best Practices, which is an e-commerce growth consultancy, as well as a newsletter where I share a lot of hot takes on marketing. I've been working in e-commerce for more than a decade. I've worked at companies of every size and every funding model, and I really help them do two things. The first is run marketing programs that actually make money. And the second is to help understand the relationship between customers, merchandise, and marketing, because that's each brand's secret sauce.
Awesome. Yeah, we have a wealth of knowledge here today, so really excited to dive into this conversation. I'll say for anyone who just joined, please feel free to add any questions in the chat as we go, and we'll stop in between questions to talk through them. So I think the first question, and this one I'm probably going to kick to Jim first, but really high level, right? It's no secret that we are in, or we have been in, an economic downturn. And thinking about how does this impact consumer spending, and what are you seeing on your end?
Yeah, I really appreciate the question because just to give the punchline ahead of time. I'm positive on the state of the consumer going into the end of the year. And I find myself, as I say that, kind of catching the words in my mouth. It's hard to say that. And it's because of, the question here is phrased the way we're all thinking, which is to say that the economy has been, I'm going to say, suspect for the last year and a half. The paradox is that the economy has continued to expand and the labor market is actually quite strong, which means that consumers have incomes and so they should be spending. However, whether it's the consumer or many of us on this call, we're aware that the Federal Reserve has been raising interest rates for most of the last year and a half. We're aware that inflation has been a problem, and the sentiment, whether it's on the economy or the consumer or investments, has really been quite lousy. But if you just look at the data, it would actually tell you the consumer's in good shape. And I want to start with a few charts here to show that. The first of these is the unemployment rate, which you can just generally see is at a very low rate. It's back to where it was before the pandemic hit. Yes, there's a little uptick here at the end. At the last monthly reading, the unemployment rate went from 3.5% to 3.8%. But make no mistake, 3.8% is an extraordinarily low unemployment rate. So while the Federal Reserve has been trying to tame inflation by raising interest rates, on the one hand, it's been successful, and I'll show it in a second that inflation's coming down, but it hasn't crushed the labor market. And I want to give a couple of other ways of looking at that. Let's go to the next slide. This is a slide of weekly unemployment insurance claims. So this is when people are laid off, they go to their state unemployment office and they file for unemployment insurance. You can see that the numbers where this graph is basically where it's been for 2 years. Again, the statement from this being that the labor market is hanging tough. Consumers have jobs. And while this year there's been a lot of talk about layoffs, I don't know if anybody remembers, but at the beginning of the year there were major layoff announcements, particularly from technology companies. And yes, you can see that in a very, very slight rise this year in the blue line. The truth of the matter is people who are laid off are quickly finding other jobs. And the reason we know that is on the next slide, which is continuing claims. So this is after people file for their initial weekly jobless claims, how long do they stay on the unemployment rolls? And you can see from where this chart is that you're not seeing an uptick in people who are staying on unemployment rolls. So people are finding jobs when they're laid off. I do realize that this graph is hard to read, but the main takeaway, if you just look at where we are on the right side of this, it's basically at a multi-decade low. So the takeaway from these 3 slides is that employment's good. People have jobs, and that's good for consumption. There's another thing that's good for consumption, which is that inflation's actually coming down. And by the way, this is the last slide. It was a little bit numbing. Yeah, a little bit mind-numbing that they all have, the same format. But this is the CPI, Consumer Price Index. This is what we call headline inflation. And this is the big one. This captures all inflation. You can see we had one heck of an inflation problem 2021 to 2022, but we can also see it's coming down meaningfully. Yes, a little uptick here on the right side. Let's pay attention to that. That seems more likely to be a blip in the overall trend where inflation is coming down. So the takeaways from all 4 of these slides is that the consumer is employed, and they've actually got wage gains. I didn't show that here. While inflation is coming down, that's a really benevolent condition going into the 4th quarter, going into the holiday spending season. I'll just add one more point. Just today, we've had a couple of companies announce major hiring sprees for the retail 4th quarter. Amazon is hiring, and I'm not making these numbers up, 250,000 people. Target is hiring 100,000 people for the holiday season. Those are big numbers. In Amazon's case, it's 2/3 higher than it was last year. So I told you in my intro that my perspective is one of looking at macroeconomic variables and what companies are saying. And from that dual perspective, I would say things look pretty darn good for the holiday spending season. And again, it's funny, I'm kind of catching the words in my mouth because we've been so conditioned the last year and a half that things are bad. They might actually not be bad. Okay, Kelsey, that's it for me. Thank you.
No, that was fantastic. Thank you for giving us all of that background context. And I think Jim set us up really well for this follow-up question of what do we think is coming in terms of consumer spending habits for this holiday season. And before I get some thoughts from Katie and Alex, I'm actually curious, Jim, on your thoughts of how do we think this year is going to look in comparison to last year or even the year before? Something we get really frequent from our customers is things are so different during COVID, right? We had a huge boom in direct to consumer, and it's really hard to have comparables in terms of performance year over year, and really thinking about forecasting and what to expect, and just curious on your thoughts there.
So there are some cross currents here. And I think that the biggest cross current is how much are people going to be spending on things, goods, and how much are they going to be spending on services? Because for the last 2 years, the average consumer has shifted from buying stuff, which is what they bought when they were home at the pandemic. You buy a new stereo, you buy new furniture, all sorts of things that they were buying to be delivered when they were stuck at home. Then they got out, and for the last 2 years, consumers have been traveling like crazy. One of the statistics that I look at on a daily basis is how many passengers are going through the United States TSA checkpoints. And consistently this year, it has been at a level that's greater than the 2019 level. So we're above that baseline pre-pandemic level. People are traveling a lot. Here's the thing. They've been traveling for a long time. I travel a lot. I got to tell you the truth. I'm tuckered out. The airports are packed. The airplanes are packed. People are coughing all over the place. This is an anecdote of one. Be very careful from it. But I think that after 2 years of consumers shifting from goods to services, we might be poised to go at least a little bit back the other way for people to kind of stay home for the holidays and buy stuff again. Regardless of whether it's goods or travel, apropos of my earlier comments, we're likely to have a better year this year than next year. In part, that's because it was a low bar to clear last year. Last year, people felt really lousy, right? I mean, all right, my perspective again, the stock market was in a bear market. The Federal Reserve was raising rates like crazy. The war in Ukraine, which continues, and other geopolitical actions, there was a lot of negativity. That kind of gets the consumer to hunker down a little bit. I think the consumer, based on everything I've said to you right now, I think the consumer is ready to spend more this holiday season. That's my take.
That's super helpful context and perspective. Katie, I'd love to kick it over to you and hear your thoughts on anything that you're hearing from your clients or where you think this holiday season is going.
Sure, yeah, thank you. And actually, Jim teed this up perfectly. We are seeing a pretty aggressive shift actually into things over services, or back into things, I guess is a better way to put it, but from the perspective of fewer and better. So when we look at the categories that are either performing well or are growing versus categories that aren't, it's really interesting the sectors that are growing, and it's the premium sector of the sector. So alcohol is growing around 9% this year. Luxury apparel and accessories are growing around 5 to 6% this year. Beauty and skincare, very wide swath, is growing pretty steadily as well. All of those growth drivers are being driven by the premium sector. And I think that touches a little bit back on question one, which is that consumer behavior has pretty dramatically shifted in terms of how they're approaching their lives. So alcohol, I think, is a great indicator for this. Alcohol being up 9% is a big jump. That's a pretty hefty uptick. What we're seeing is that across the board, people are dining out less. And when they do dine out, they don't go to drinks before or after. So we're seeing that reservations in restaurants, instead of being the peak time being between 8 and 10 p.m., it's now between 5 and 7 p.m. And it's the same people. It's the same young professionals who are going out to eat, but they are doing it much, much, much earlier. And they are cutting out the pre-dinner drinks, and they are cutting out the post-dinner drinks. But alcohol is rising. What's happening across the board in the premium alcohol sector is that people are entertaining at home. So they're making, instead of having like a quick beer, they're making these elaborate cocktails. They're building out their home bars. They're buying nicer ingredients. So they are still spending money, and in alcohol's case, they are spending more money, but it's very specifically on a fewer, better model for a fundamental step change in where they spend their time. It's a lot more at home. I think, again, that retraction, we all ran out of our homes post-COVID, and now we're kind of coming back. Like, it's expensive to travel. It's exhausting. It's a tough place. Like, hospitality is not what it was pre-COVID. So I think people are kind of shifting back into spending more time at home, spending more time with friends, and doing sort of like a deeper, nicer version of it. Very similar in beauty and skincare. In beauty and skincare, we're seeing a retraction on the mass side, but a heavy uptick on the premium side, which again is sort of surprising. You'd think if people didn't have money to spend, or if they were nervous about spending, that they wouldn't be buying premium goods. But if you need to spend more to spend less, skincare is a great place to do it. If you can buy really expensive, nice skincare or services, you now need less makeup. You're probably getting fewer facials. You probably need fewer treatments. I think there's a lot of kind of trading out of consistent behaviors into sort of efficacy, cost per wear. Like, I will spend $1,000 on a handbag, but I'm only going to buy one this year instead of 3 or 4. I'm going to buy 1 or 2 nice sweaters instead of do a Shein haul of 1 million dresses. I think there's been a big retraction in that space from a lot of factors, from sustainability, from feeling good about what you're buying, from knowing what's going into your body or on your face. And I think that's playing out where we are spending less discretionarily and more into what would be a long-term value, but those categories are still growing. So I think when we talk about less discretionary spending, we sort of think people will spend less dollars, and they aren't. They're just spending it in a slightly different place. And I think for brands, for retail, all of those are heavy gifting categories. So there are things where if you are approaching what's going to happen at holiday, beauty will probably do very well. Skincare and fragrance will probably do very well. Alcohol will probably do very well. But the luxury versions, right? So I think when we're framing up our mind, it's around like, how are you doing a value proposition? How are you describing quality so that people feel like they're getting the good version?
Super interesting. I have kind of a follow-up question there, and Alex, you might have some thoughts as well. But I'm curious on what you think the split is going to be between buying online versus in retail. And we know many Rockerbox clients are pushing back into brick and mortar, where maybe during COVID, those retail locations closed or they didn't expand as aggressively. And I think that's really helpful for our customers as they think about, like, where do we expect our revenue to come from? Is that coming from someone going to the store and being able to feel the good, right, before they purchase it, or doing more of that online shopping? And anyone can hop in here, but just something that was kind of top of mind for me.
Do you want to go?
No, I mean, I had thoughts on the first question, but I don't want to break the flow. So if you have...
Yeah, we can come back to thoughts on first.
Or, I mean, question 2, what's on the slide? The school versus e-com.
Yeah, Katie, not sure if you had any thoughts on the retail piece, and then Alex, we can come back to you for sure.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the short-term answer is that I don't have a crystal ball, and I think none of us do. I think behavior is all over the place. So when we're trying to look at behavioral data patterns, it's that everyone is an omni shopper, everyone is doing both. Where they make the final purchase, really category dependent. There are things like, again, skincare, where it might behoove you to just get it on subscription. So in that case, that would increase online. Alcohol is probably going to be in store. Even though you could do sort of like a drizzly delivery model, alcohol is likely to be in store. Because the shift is into more luxury goods, we are definitely going to see more physical traffic in store. As to whether or not they buy in store, I mean, that depends. It depends a lot. I will say it depends a lot on how good your website is. And if you need to tighten it up and get it more clear, you're going to get more dollars doing it that way. But I think broadly, it's one of those things that we bounce back and forth between this a lot, which is that the consumers do not separate these pillars. The consumers shop in both. Their expectation is everything is the same in both. It's whenever the mood strikes them that they're going to pull the trigger on purchasing. So you need to be ready in both. I think rather than being like, okay, 30% from e-com and 70% in store, it depends a lot on category. It depends a lot on the environment in both cases. And it depends on the druthers of the consumer right then, right? Like, regionality is going to play a role. The tax services you can have are going to play a role. There are a lot of kind of like macro factors where I don't know if it's helpful to look at it that way. I think it's more helpful to sort of look at, if you have both, or if you have multiple options, like a D2C site and Amazon, and you're sold into retail, be ready in all 3 of those. And if you have it available to you and your supply chain is available to you, be as flexible as possible in where you move your goods.
Absolutely. That's great perspective. And
Maybe
Alex,
maybe I'll add
yeah, go ahead, Jim.
And I hesitate to do this because my perspective here may not be as useful as Katie and Jennifer's. But one of the things from an investor's point of view, when we look at retail right now, it's very hard to ignore the theft that's been going on at many stores. Now, I'm not saying that this is going to deter a shopper who's going to Louis Vuitton or Rolex or whatever. I'm not saying that they're going to be deterred from doing that out of fear that they might get caught up in a robbery or something. But here's where on the margins it might have an impact. I think many of us have seen when we go to the common drugstore that a lot of things are behind plastic cases, locked plastic cases now. And you have to actually ask somebody to unlock the case and open it up and get the things you need. Now, again, I want to be careful. I'm not suggesting that the holiday spending that we're talking about on this call is germane to the trip to CVS, but here's where on the margin it may matter. The average consumer may say, the heck with it. I really don't want to go to Rite Aid or whatever. I'm going to buy my shaving cream online. And that's one fewer trip outside the house for the consumer, one fewer trip outside the office for the consumer, a physical trip that they otherwise might run into a holiday shopping gift item that they would want to buy. So again, my perspective, that of an investor, shrink as it's called, or theft amongst other things in the retail space, is something that we've got a very close eye on. And we're very curious to see if it drives more people to online retail as opposed to physical store presence.
Very interesting and something that I hadn't considered, so appreciate that. Alex, I did want to bring it back to you. I know you had some more broad thoughts here that I want to make sure we get to.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to bring up the elephant in the room. So I've been seeing similar things where my clients who are either basically targeting household incomes of 125K or more, whether it be through product quality or positioning, they're doing great. But that's not the majority of Americans. It's not the majority of the economy. And when you look at kind of secondary data sources like online forums, Facebook groups, and you're monitoring over time, how often are people bringing up like, I'm feeling squeezed, I'm short on cash, I'm looking for a side hustle. The incidence of that is becoming more and more frequent. So something that's underlying all of the data that we're seeing about inflation and consumer spending is people are spending more money for the same unit volume because the price of everything is going up. So the more your business depends, especially during the holiday period, the more your business depends on impulse purchases from people who are on that end, basically the average American consumer, it kind of makes things a bit more fragile or a bit more precipitous as we're going into Q4 this year. Your demand during Q4 holiday, it's coming from three places. It's coming from your existing customer base. It's coming from people who are brand aware but haven't pulled the trigger yet. And then it's coming from like pure in-market demand, like impulse purchases that are driven by holiday. And the greater percent of your demand that's coming from that in-market impulse purchase, the more of a gamble it becomes, and the more that you're really depending on like, well, what's the overall story in terms of economic growth? So I think what brands should really be focusing on is how do I grow my pool of existing customers? How do I grow my pool of brand aware customers going into the holiday? Because that gives you a bit of more control over your own destiny.
Yeah, I really love that segmentation of thinking about existing customers, who's brand aware, and then there's that last bucket of impulse buys that maybe you have less control over. Alex, I'm not sure, this is going off topic a little bit, but because we're here, if you have any suggestions for brands who are thinking about like, how do I build that group of users that are brand aware during this kind of time of year building up into the holidays?
Yeah, I think one thing that brands can do is to focus a lot of their spend and attention on the period of like September through November? What are you doing to build awareness? And does that mean spending more and maybe more as a percent of overall revenue just during that period than you initially planned? Because you're trying to drive customer acquisition when it's a less competitive environment, and you're also just trying to build a pool of awareness. And then the other thing that brands can do, which unfortunately this year it's too late to action on, but thinking about how can I create some kind of other tentpole moment during the year, again, during a less competitive time, almost like Amazon originally did with Prime Day. Like that's a shopping holiday they completely made up. So how do you pull some of the pressure out of the Q4 period in a way that's a bit more creative?
Absolutely. I think this leads us a little bit into the next question around just a better understanding of sentiment across brands as they head into the holiday season. And I'm not sure if maybe, Katie and Alex, this is more geared towards you, if you have any thoughts here that you'd like to speak to.
Sure. From the perspective of the brands that we work with, I'm going to be brutally honest. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of nerves around it. I think Alex really made some great points earlier that you need to take the pressure off yourself earlier and more often to sort of even it out so that you don't have an emotional and financial big hit in Q4. I think for a long time, the wholesale model and the retail model were very heavily on all your money is back half. And I think you need to kind of layer things out. What I'm seeing from brands are two different strategies for how they want to approach year end, both of which are around driving as much revenue as possible. Some brands use holiday as a time to sort of move goods off their book. So they are very focused on units sold, getting inventory out of your warehouse, making room for new, kind of getting things off the books, start fresh for a new year. I think that is one valid strategic move for holiday. For them, promotion and making sure that you're getting as many eyeballs as possible and as many human beings as possible, whether they're your customer or not, like a long-term customer, if you are fine on selling a single unit at a pretty aggressively discounted price because you just want it gone. So you're not necessarily looking at the unit economics of the good, and you aren't necessarily looking at the profitability because long-term for you just need them out of your warehouse. Those people strategically are thinking very heavily about promo. They're thinking very heavily about moving things out. How can they entice the consumer to move as fast as possible? I've already gotten my first of 2 Black Friday emails about a week ago. So definitely brands are feeling the pinch on like, let's make this holiday more than a quarter long.
Yeah.
The second pillar of people who use holiday for their profitability drivers. So again, like I look to beauty a lot for this. A lot of profits are made in the beauty sector at holiday. There are entire divisions that are built around holiday sets and gifting, and a lot of focus on that. Alcohol is similar. For those brands, there's a layer of strategically they need to be a little bit tighter and a little more sound than just having a limited edition good. I think for a long time you could make a lot of money on having a one-shot promo or a limited edition product or packaging or a bundle that only happened at holiday. I think for those brands, they need to be a lot more creative, again, to Alex's earlier point, in how they're messaging people and how they're positioning. I think for them, we are working a lot on really, one, cleaning up their websites so that they get traffic that is not paid. You do need to get those numbers up for holiday. Everyone on earth is on the internet at holiday. You should be getting a healthy amount of organic traffic. That also brings your bid costs down, which means you can spend more in media and get more eyeballs, and it's not as expensive as it would be. But also the experience on the website. People, and in store, but I'm from an e-commerce background, which is that people need to understand the value and the quality of the good in a way they maybe didn't before. You used to be able to be like, this is the only holiday set palette. We only have 1,000 of them. They are exclusive to, say, Sephora. And that was enough to drive people to buy. It's not now. I think you need to be a lot more clear on like the reason we made this set is for something. It's better ingredients, it's sustainable. There needs to be a reason other than beautiful packaging. And I've seen a lot of brands plan earlier, move into the space earlier. I think brands are getting more on board. They are looking at this as a longer term play of maybe they won't be sold through the goods on Black Friday, and that's fine because they've made good goods they can have a healthy margin on through the end of the year.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, I don't want to skip too quickly, but I feel like this tees up our next question really well. And talking about, do we think that discounting is going to be broadly a popular approach this year, or do we see, more, I would say, outside of holiday, something we've seen across our customers is this year is a big focus on profitability. Really needing to focus on what's our return on investment and not just being able to kind of spend whatever you can if you hit a certain CAC target, right? And just wondering what sort of impact do we see that having on discounting during holiday? And Alex, maybe you have some thoughts here.
Yeah, I mean, I think discounting is always going to be part of the holiday narrative, especially. There are brands in holiday who are competing for market share, and there are brands who are competing for growth. And the market share brands are the ones that we all know. They're the household names. They're the ones who are like really thinking about promo strategy and competing with each other. Who has the most compelling promo? If you are not one of those brands, if you're sub $250 million a year, if you're not in a hyper consolidated market, if you're either DTC, primarily driving your revenue via DTC, or you have like a really tight lock on your channel strategy and you're not super exposed in wholesale to those brands who are competing for market share, you don't have to be like watching the competition and trying to competitively match your promos to like the Nikes and the Walmarts and the Targets of the world, because there's enough within the pool of consumer growth. There's just enough churn that you can capture that and grow without having to go head to head with some of these big players. So what you have to think about your promo strategy, like, is this actually accomplishing the goal that I'm setting out to achieve here? Like Katharine mentioned, clearing out inventory, that's one objective brands might have. But I think there's also just a lot of pressure to make Q4 like bigger and bigger and bigger each year. And what I do is I when I work with clients, I say like, okay, what kind of customers are you acquiring during holiday? What's the mix between new versus returning? Are these customers that you're acquiring like actually coming back? Were the promos profitable? And then once you have that information, you can think like, okay, we ran 20% off site-wide last year. We don't have to necessarily go to 30% off this year because we have to go bigger. Like, let's take a step back and think about what are we actually trying to accomplish on a customer level.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think many of our customers who joined today will as well, of thinking about cohorting out that group of customers that convert during holiday and what's the lifetime value of those customers and what do you see your relationship being with that moving forward. So that's really helpful. Jim, I'm not sure if you had any thoughts on this one that you wanted to speak to.
I actually do.
Great.
Again, I've telegraphed a number of times my perspective is that of an investor. But I think what's going to be very interesting for people on this call is to consider global brands versus domestic brands, because it's tautological right now to say that the U.S. economy is really the best economy on the globe. Not always the case, but it is right now. Europe is dealing with the war in Ukraine, which is having a lot of effects on their economy, including inflation because of energy prices. And the European economy really is in recession. China is kind of a mess from an economic point of view. But as I was talking about earlier, the U.S. is doing really quite well. So what this means is for global brands, and I don't mean to pick on anyone, but if I were just to take Nike and Starbucks, those are global brands. They're having real issues outside the U.S. It's being reflected in their stock prices. Now, I'm not a marketer, so maybe a marketer at Nike would say, you know what, above all else here in the U.S., we're going to charge premium prices. I mean, that may be a marketing strategy, I don't know. But I can tell you that at Nike, I'm not picking on Nike, I think it's a fabulous company. I think it's a fabulous brand. But they're really having issues in China. It's not their making, it's just what the Chinese economy does. And that could place pressure on them to make sure they have a good domestic holiday season, whether that includes discounting or not.
Yeah, that's super helpful perspective. And we do have, I even see some of our brands that joined today have a global presence. So really helpful to think through that. I know that we have kind of one more broad question to wrap us out, and then we can open up for any Q&A from people who have joined us today. But I think we've already talked about this throughout our conversation today, but maybe we can address it a little bit more explicitly on what sort of impact do the trends that we've spoken about from different perspectives have for brands as they prepare for the holiday season. And maybe from each of you can just provide any advice from your end, or just like top things that you would be thinking about. Katie, do you want to kick us off here?
Sure. I think the largest behavioral impacts that you're going to see are from the consumer emotional sentiment, which is that when they are purchasing, they are looking for high quality, they are looking for good value, and they're looking for long lasting. So likely you already have your promotions built out for holiday. I'll assume that you do. So you're not going to affect that so much, but I would take a look at the way that you talk about them and the way that you position them. So if your website is not incredibly clear and talking a lot about the problems that you solve in that good, or how long it will last, or how valuable it is to the consumer, you're maybe missing out on a cohort of people who are looking for that kind of messaging. I think there's a second layer to that when you are seeking new entrants to your brand, or you're trying to buy traffic, you really need to be focused on what they consider valuable. So even if you are running a promotional strategy, doing a waterfall, which is sort of the standard holiday strategy for the last several years, is probably not going to behoove you. You are going to hit a point where another 10% off is not going to demonstrably move more customers to purchase from you. I would build that in. Make sure that you are not going to hit a panic point closer to Black Friday where you haven't sold in enough goods yet and you're offering another 10% off. You don't want to look at promos where it was one day only. Oops, just kidding, we ran it again. Oops, just kidding, we're going to run this until the end of the time. Consumers have gotten very savvy to those kind of marketing tactics, and it erodes trust. So when we're going back to people are looking for fewer and better, bear in mind that trust is a big part of better. Equity is a big part of better. How the consumer feels about your brand, your product, the way that you're talking to them is a big part of that impact. They want to feel like you have their back, that what you bring to market is good. I think you need to shift probably your messaging away from this is cool into this is solving a problem of yours long term.
So more focus on value probably. Alex, I'll turn it to you before we wrap up with Jim here.
So I would say the more you're depending, or the more your holiday strategy depends on going into the second half of November and trying to purchase in market demand, the more painful holiday is going to be for you. So I would recommend that everyone take the last week of September and look at a few numbers. What were my holiday sales last year? What was the split between new versus returning customers? What do I want those sales to be this year? Like, how much growth am I planning? And then last year, what was the momentum trend in new customer acquisition and also in site traffic overall leading up into the holiday period? And then looking at my media spend and my customer acquisition trends for Q3 so far, am I on that same trajectory? Like, am I growing enough? And for October and November, am I budgeted to grow my traffic pool and my customer pool enough to accomplish that growth target that I'm looking for in holiday? That will give you an idea of how much you need to think about additional strategy and planning and marketing leading into the holiday period. I would recommend that anyone figure out a way to run a broader awareness campaign in October and the second half of November. Figure out a way to grow your traffic pool, even if it is with paid. And then on a really tactical level, when it comes to holiday, simple promos always perform better. If it's like a crazy stacked promo, a casual person who's just landing on your site isn't going to understand or have the patience for that. So just make sure your promos and the way you communicate them across all of your marketing materials are straightforward and easy to digest. Like, show them to your mom, show them to your friend who's not in the industry. Make sure that it's making sense.
Thank you for that, and super helpful. And finally, Jim, anything from your end?
Sure. I just want to level set expectations here. 25 years ago, when I was in business school, marketing was one of the core curriculum topics. And I remember they made us do a virtual simulation of you've got this product and how much do you pay for shelf space and how much do you do in promo and how much you spend on advertising. And I'll just tell you right now, I didn't do very well on this marketing competition. So take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. It's just from an investor's point of view. But with what we've been talking about today, the belief, at least my belief, the U.S. consumer is doing really quite well. And outside the U.S., things are not going that well. What I would suggest to anybody running a brand or thinking about promos going into the holiday season, I would suggest holding the line on pricing and not gouging, because everybody's still wincing quite a bit from inflation. But the consumer seems healthier than people have given credit for. And I would hold the line on pricing. Having said that, I very much defer to Katie and Alex, who know a heck of a lot more about marketing than I do.
No, that's really helpful perspective. And while we move to Q&A, and we'll see if anyone has questions, I just want to give a big thank you to each of our panelists. This was a really well-rounded conversation with different perspectives that I think our customers and other partners who have joined will find really helpful. So thank you all. Is there any questions from anyone that joined? We can spend a few minutes on Q&A. And for anyone who wasn't able to join the whole session, we will have a recording available after, and you'll see that Ashley, our head of marketing, just dropped a comment there in the chat. So if you do have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat there. Awesome. Well, your answers were so thorough that apparently we answered everyone's questions regarding consumer spending. So I just want to give a big thank you again to our panelists, and thank you to everyone who joined. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Oh, Ashley has one before we close out. And I think this is a great one actually, or maybe Ashley here can say it live since you joined us.
Yeah, thank you. I figured it was being a little bit quiet in the chat, but I have a question. We focused a lot. I think you guys, first of all, amazing session. I think that, to echo Kelsey, there was just a lot of different perspectives here, which I really valued. But I was thinking we spent a lot of time focusing on like luxury items, and there's, I think, an argument to be made that consumer spending is just trending in a way that supports luxury items more than it does. I think Katie, you mentioned like Shein and like some of those other types of companies that maybe sell products that are not quite as sustainable or not quite into the luxury market. But I know that there are a lot of brands out there that is not their value proposition, and they are not necessarily selling a luxury item. What should those brands be doing or thinking about moving into the holiday season, kind of given everything else that we've been talking about today? Anyone can answer. I'm not as good at this as Kelsey is.
I kind of have thoughts on that. I think there's an element where, outside of actual categorization of what a luxury product is or a premium product is, that luxury is personal to the consumer. So outside of being the actual luxury sector, whatever it is that you sell has a value prop to it. And the value prop is not only that it's a low price. Even for things that are incredibly low price, that is not the only value of the good that you have. And I think it's really important to drive home what the value is and what the quality is. And I will bring up beauty again, because I think it's really interesting that prestige beauty and skincare is what's driving the growth in that sector. But if you actually look at what's happening in the sector, the most profitable or fastest growing brand that's driving the growth in it is The Ordinary. And The Ordinary, while it is considered a luxury product, their average order or average product is about $15. So $15 to $16 is what's driving the category's growth from a premium side. From the mass side in beauty, the brand that is driving the growth is Olay, and the average order good from them is $30. Those are different value props in a similar market. The reason that you're buying the 100% niacinamide solution, or maybe 10%, don't burn your faces, the 10% niacinamide solution from The Ordinary, is so that you don't have to buy $100 face cream, right? It's still premium, but you're trading out the luxury premium for efficacy premium. I think in the Olay example, it's luxurious to be able to have more wears per cost, right? Like you're buying the huge Costco bottle instead of the smaller bottle, and you're saving probably a couple dollars all in, but your total ticket is higher. I think trading into how the consumer thinks about what they're buying and what they need is really important in terms of your value prop, regardless of what the actual cost of your good is.
Yeah, I have some thoughts on this as well. I would reframe the question a bit. I wouldn't think about it in terms of luxury versus mass. I would think about it in terms of how do I target a higher household income consumer, not only higher household income, but high disposable income. And when you think about it from demographics and just like, what's the probability I'm going to shoot out my ad and hit one of those people, it's really targeting people over 45, because not only do they have higher household incomes, but they're probably through that high spending period where it's like they've just had kids. They're spending all their money on like their kids and buying a house and their mortgage and all of that. So thinking about what's my strategy for reaching out to potentially like the consumer who's over 45. I have a client in the healthcare space who has a product line that's specifically targeted at dads, and that crushes because that it's hitting that higher household income consumer. And it's not a luxury brand. It's an AOV over $100, but it's not like they're trying to compete with Goop or something. So I think there's a way for almost any brand to do it, but it's just thinking about it in those demographic terms.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think speaking to the demo over 45, and Alex, probably follow-up question for you, but how do you advise the brands that you work with and how that dictates the way that they're buying their media and where they're investing dollars? Because someone who's wanting to target that over 45 audience might not be pushing a lot into TikTok, for example. And how does that impact the budget spread across channels?
So the good news is that if you're doing a lot of customer acquisition on Meta, there's a big overlap between that 45 plus, like very e-com oriented audience and the people who are on Facebook and Instagram clicking on ads and buying things. So it's just a matter of looking at, you can even see the demographic breakdown of who's converting on different ad creative and trying to spot the patterns in terms of what products, what art direction, what video editing, what messaging is working with that demo, and then really iterating into that and scaling. I think it's also a matter of looking at your sales data and your product assortment and just looking at what are your VIP customers buying in what combinations, and are there bundles or offers or things that people are already opting into who are becoming VIP customers that I'm not leveraging as a marketing tactic currently.
Yeah, I love that. I think something we didn't talk about much today, but is definitely top of mind for our customers, is bundling and identifying what are those bundles you should target based on customer LTV or different user cohorts. I think is a really interesting strategy. Ashley, any other questions? This was a good one.
No, this was wonderful. I just wanted to thank you all again for joining us. I mean, honestly, this was an amazing session. I think that, Alex, you gave some really amazing advice around like brand awareness. And I think that we tend to forget about that, especially when we're coming into the holidays. It's like one of those things that's like first to go, right? Like, oh, it's just a branded campaign, or it's just an awareness campaign. But I think that's so important, especially as we are trying to, Katie, to your point, tell these brand stories in a way that really resonate with our target consumer, or maybe the consumer that we want to target as we continue to move in market. And Jim, as always, thank you so much. You had wonderful insight into kind of the consumer side of this and how we should expect people to actually spend their money, because at the end of the day, that's what we're here talking about, right? Like, We are all just trying to figure out how humans are going to operate in a way that benefits our businesses. So I think this was a really wonderful session. I appreciate all three of you for joining. And Kelsey, thank you for moderating. You did a fantastic job. And Maggie, what do we have next?
And I was just gonna say, I agree all around. That was fantastic. So next up, and then after this also, we have 2 customer stories back to back. That's one thing we heard people really liked from our last conference, summer camp, was customer stories. So we have Pneumatic coming up here in about 10 minutes. And then right after that, our partner Tatari is going to talk to Storyworth. So 2 great stories coming up. Once again, access that link in your calendar or the email that you just got a few minutes ago. And we will see you over there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.